South East Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South East Radio.
Welcome back to South East Radio's Business Matters with me, Karl Fitzpatrick. Well, my final guest this week, Finn from Treasury Solutions, believes that governments and large corporates can be instrumental players in combating the economic distress caused by the coronavirus. John, with over 30 years' experience, you've witnessed recessions, the collapse of the property market and the dot-com crash. But what is different about the coronavirus?
I guess two things: the speed at which it's hit and the depth that it will strike at. I suppose best case scenario, if all goes well, if I can put it that way, this will be, there'll be a recession. I think there will be, but it will be short. It'll be sharp, but it'll be short. But I think the speed with which it's arisen, because even in the post-financial crisis in 2008, we had a couple of days, all right, where the banks were looking a bit dodgy as to whether they'd survive or not. But once we got over that, we could see the slowdown coming. It was going to take time. It would work its way out. We haven't had that notice this time. And I think that's the bit that probably scares people as much as anything else. And it's that confidence that, in business, confidence is so important because it evaporates very quickly and it can be very slow to come back.
So the coronavirus is going to push us into the next recession as far as you're concerned. How long will that recession last?
It really depends on how quickly, the government can respond, because this will be driven by government responses around the world, not just here. And secondly, in some respects, how the civic response is. And it's been very good to date, because the quicker we deal with the process, the quicker we come out of it. At the end of the day, this is a flu. It's a virus. They don't last for years on end. So if we follow the instructions, I suppose, in the medical sense, and we try and make sure that we don't have that peak, that will dictate a lot of it too. It really will.
Now, John, of course, the government have to respond in two different ways. Firstly and foremostly in relation to health, but secondly, economically. So how should the government respond to this crisis and pandemic from an economic perspective in order to shorten that recession?
This is where it's going to get tricky, Karl, because it's got to be fast and it's got to be a lot of money in some respects directed in the right places. And this is where they're going to have a problem. I think they can get their hands on money very quickly and very cheaply. We know that. They can borrow at negative interest rates now up to probably 10 years. So getting access to money per se is not the issue. It's how do we get it into the economy? Because anything that's going to be pushed through banks will require the banks to go through a credit process. And as we know, credit processes take time. And I think the analogy that I've used in the past week in this is that there's a certain amount of ICU beds in the country, and I think it's 250. So if you have 5,000 people presenting at the one time, you simply can't deal with it. And we'd have the same on the credit side. We have a certain amount of banks and a certain amount of credit people within the bank who deal with these applications. And can they deal with a couple of hundred at a time? Probably. Can they deal with 5,000 or 10,000? No, they can't. So that's the pinch point, and that's going to be the real crux for the government. I think they may have to look at this in a number of different ways, Karl, as a result.
One of the things that we've seen happen in Hong Kong is they've actually dropped the equivalent of €1,000 a month into every adult's account over there. What are your thoughts in relation to that, what they call helicopter money?
It's happened before. The Japanese tried it because their economy has been stagnant for so long. They did it, and the problem is that sometimes people just hoard it. The idea in their case was to give it to people so that they spend it, and if they spend it, the economy keeps ticking over. Then the jobs stay, and you get the benefits from that. So could it work? It could work in the short term, but I think we need something a little bit more in terms of giving people certainty, if I can put it that way, for 3 to 6 months on a number of different fronts, because again, they need to know that will, because you give people 1,000 ahead, how long is that going to last for? Will it last a month? Will it last 2 months? What's it going to go on? Are there other ways you can do it? And the problem, of course, as you said, is we need to act quickly, and there's only so many things that can be done as well. But could it work? Yes, it could work. Is it the solution on its own? No, it's not.
Is one of the solutions here, and a part solution being a job retention scheme, as in an employment subsidy scheme where the government would give businesses, let's say, €200 to €250 per week towards covering the cost of wages for all of its staff?
That would certainly help, because again, if you think about it, most businesses, the problem is now that they're not making any sales. So if they're not making sales, the money's not coming in. If the money's not coming in, how do you pay staff? So it certainly would buy time. I mean, I've heard them early in the week talking about doing something along those lines that, pay people and you'll get the money back. That won't work because simply too many companies don't have the money. So they'd have to be funded directly. And again, the question is, well, how do you get that money to them unless you can literally make mass applications for X number of staff now for Y number of weeks and get that money. I just see that there's a couple of angles here. Revenue has come up. And just to give an example, Sweden announced earlier in the week that they were deferring tax payments for all Swedish companies for up to 12 months. Now, I don't think we can afford to do that because our government finances are not in as good a shape as Sweden. But that sort of stuff straight away gives companies leeways. And they also, I think, announced that they would subsidise jobs for the periods of April and May, up to May as well. So they seem to be moving quickly. In fact, I'd nearly look at what the Swedes are doing, and because they rarely get it wrong in Northern Europe, and look at those angles. So revenue here, deferring paying your VAT and your POI for a couple of months. I think they need to be very clear and say if you don't do it, it's okay. I know they've said they won't charge interest and it won't affect your tax compliance. People are terrified of having a revenue problem. They just are. And I think revenue are going to have to be stronger, and the government's going to have to tell the revenue to be stronger in that regard to allay that fear for starters.
Now, the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland is, of course, a government bank. They don't have a branch network across the country, so they won't be known to many of our listeners. But can you give us an overview in terms of what their role is? Because they have a new scheme coming on track called the Working Capital Scheme, which is due to launch over the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, so the Strategic Banking Corporation, or SBCI as they're known, basically they can tap into really cheap money in Europe through the European Investment Bank. And the idea is that they tap into that cheap money and then they funnel it out to companies. But as you said, they don't have a branch network. They can't lend directly to people. So they're dependent on lending it through the banks. And this is your problem. They could raise money very quickly again and get access to very cheap money again, but it's depending on getting it out through the branch network. And we're back into that problem, as I said, about if they lend to the banks, how do they get it out? One, maybe, this is an idea I put forward about 10 or 12 years ago, and it's actually coming at it in reverse. It doesn't solve all the problems, but as I said, you'll probably need 5 or 6 initiatives in parallel taking the pressure. Suppose all the large companies, like companies turning over 50 million plus in the country, looked at their books and said, right, anybody that we owe 30 grand or less to, instead of paying them in 30 days' time or 45 days' time, we're going to pay them now. We're going to give them their money straight away, so they'll have that coming in immediately. There might only be 200, 300 companies of that size in the country who could do that, but you might be able to get 2 or 3 or 400 million out very quickly. And why not look at somebody like the government or the banks through SBCI funding those companies? Now, they may not even need the funding. I suppose the one I'm thinking about is in the food sector, because a lot of small food producers will be dealing with multiples like Tesco's and SuperValu and Dunn's. And they're all large companies, which if they couldn't finance that sort of stuff themselves, no bank would have a problem lending to them for a short term, because all they're doing is paying 30 days early. But that 30 days could be crucial for the first 30 days for a lot of those food companies. And looking at doing something similar for other large companies, I think that would help a lot.
There's 2 questions that businesses need to ask. They need to ask questions about profitability and liquidity. But in terms of liquidity, what should they be focusing on, and what answers should they be looking to get to?
I suppose you've literally got to run cash flow forecasts by day, every day for the next 6 to 8 weeks, and see how that looks. See what money is supposed to go out. See what money is due to come in from sales already made. And then look to see what the gap is. There's going to be a negative figure, we know that. And then begin to, I suppose, peel off, well, what could I do? So if, for example, I deferred paying the revenue for a couple of months, and I said that's assuming the government come out and say it's okay to do. That will plug some of the gap. If the banks say, well, look, you don't have to pay your principal on your loans for 3 or 6 months, does that plug the gap further? So in other words, you're not going to the bank looking for 100% of the gap, but you're saying to the bank, well, look, I've done this and I've done that and I've done the other, and I'm coming up with 40% of the gap that I need. And identifying what that figure is as early as possible, I think, is vital. Maybe coordinating that through industry bodies in some way, shape or form, that sort of companies can sort of say, this is what we're looking for by week or something over the next number of weeks. And it's because we're almost trying to quantify a number here, aren't we? To sort of say this is the amount of help that needs to go into it. But I think that every company's going to have to do it, because if they talk to their bank, and you'd probably encourage early talking to the banks, like now. But as I said, I just keep coming back to the main problem, which is that if we have to go through a credit process in a bank, it's just not fast enough. We need something that will work in 2 weeks.
What's your message to the government in that respect?
There's 3 or 4 or 5 lines that they need to run with concurrently there, which is give them the leeway on the tax, give them the leeway on the principal repayments, probably for individuals. Give them maybe 3 to 6 months deferral on mortgages, for example. Because, if I've had 6 months onto my mortgage and I have 10 years left my mortgage, whether I have it paid in 10 or 10 and a half years, to me today really doesn't matter. But I need to know that I don't have, that money doesn't have to go out for the next 3 or 6 months.
In terms of quantitative easing, what are your thoughts on that?
I suppose quantitative easing for the listeners is just printing money. And printing money is going to be the key part of this solution globally. But there's no other way around it, because cutting interest rates doesn't work anymore. Interest rates are zero. The private sector has been hit so quickly that it can't get access to the credit, as we've spoken about for the last few minutes. So printing money and pushing it into economies is going to be the key part of the solution. Now, of course, the problem with that is that means they've got to borrow money, and eventually it's got to be paid back. But I guess if you have to borrow today to buy yourself time and give yourself a couple of years. As you know, governments, when they borrow slightly differently. They borrow on the bond market, and that basically means they borrow, say, $1 billion today. If they borrow it for 10 years, they pay the interest every year on it, and then they pay the $1 billion back at the end of 10 years. They don't have to make partial repayments. So in a lot of cases, what governments do is they just reborrow a new $1 billion to repay the old $1 billion when it comes due. And our government actually has done a pretty good job in the last few years, or the NTMA have, in having to refinance an awful lot of the debt that we had post the banking crisis. So it's going to be fundamental. I think they're all going to do it globally.
But really, when it comes to quantitative easing, there's 3 avenues that money can flow through. Firstly, through the helicopter money, which is where you're crediting people's individual bank accounts with a certain sum, whether that's a once-off or on a monthly basis. Secondly, through the SBCI into the SME type organisations. And then thirdly, through the stock market. Is that it, John?
Other initiatives take time, Karl. So they can borrow money, for example, to start. If you started, for example, a big roads program in the morning, or anything of a capital nature, that employs people, it gets people off the dole, and that's what you would generally see in a lot of countries, because there's a thing called the multiplier effect. And what happens is, again, if people are employed doing that sort of stuff, they tend to spend that money, and therefore it recycles into the economy, because that means they buy goods and services, and that creates more jobs and more demand, and that multiplier effect is what you want. But that takes time. So they could probably announce a program of that sort of stuff as well sometime in the next couple of weeks, and say we'll be kicking that off because we're going to, bring forward the broadband program or something else. I mean, this will start a big debate, though, Karl, once we get over this, about the whole issue of allocation of wealth. Who has the money, who doesn't, how do we do it fair? I think personally this will push value, the whole debate around communities and the importance of the SME sector. The health sector clearly is not fit for purpose. We've known that for a long time. This is going to accelerate a lot of that. So there's a lot of big issues that will come out of it in due course, but we have to get over this lull, this dip, for the next probably 8 to 12 weeks before we can look at those bigger issues. And
in terms of recovery, it will take time for the wheels to get into motion again and for the economy to pick up pace.
I guess what will happen is it'll come back to the governments again. Private sector demand might take time, so governments will have to step in, and this is why the borrowing of money and, I suppose, government initiatives will have to take place. So, for example, think of our tourism industry. For tourism to kick in, people will have to start travelling again. Now, people will start travelling again, and they'll travel once they know that the peak of the virus is over. I've heard different debates around this. You could have, what's stopping you have another virus in 2 years? Well, it's 102 years since we had the last pandemic. We've done an awful lot of travelling in the last 20 years. I mean, everyone travels all over the world. We've had, flus, but nothing like this. And, they'll develop a vaccine as well, remember. There's talk of them already trying some drugs, and even some existing drugs. They've tried them in some cases, and they've found people to react positively. So, that has all taken less time. I think it took them 5 months with SARS to kind of identify they call it the genomic code, to break it down. They had it done in 4 weeks this time. So they have been working on vaccination. So that's what I'm saying. Flus naturally work their way out. Vaccinations will become available. This will be short, sharp stuff. So the question really is, as I said, how do you almost get back to normal again? How do we get back doing business again, trading? And for that to happen, it means that we have to know that the worst is over on the viral front.
Now, John, as well as being the Managing Director of Treasury Solutions, you're also the founder of Treasury Hub, a collaboration between 7 of the largest independent accountancy firms in the country. What's the objective of the Treasury Hub?
I suppose we have a couple of key objectives in it. We started it 2 years ago, Karl, and really the focus was to be the best at dealing with banks for the SME sector in the country. Because I suppose that's what I've been doing, as you said in the intro, for the last 30 years. There's a certain speciality to dealing with banks and getting it done right, but there's a lot of common sense once you know what you're doing. And basically we wanted to be the go-to people. There's a regional focus of the Treasury Hub. We have a couple of offices in Dublin of firms, but we're also right around the country, and including in Enniscorthy. Baker Tilly are a Treasury Hub member, and they have offices locally in Enniscorthy. So it's a regional bias. It's bringing that expertise locally, so you don't have to go to Dublin or to anywhere else. I suppose Dublin being the obvious place. And I suppose I feel about it, Karl, too, because I'm from the Midlands originally. I think the importance of being able to access services of a high standard locally and create those jobs locally and keep that expertise locally benefits, the wider economy, because everyone benefits from it, because obviously if there's better services locally, then you get better companies and better service providers, doing new things locally, and the whole thing kind of steamrolls. So ultimately, this, as I said, it was set up to try and just manage that whole dealing with the banks bit. So whether it's borrowing, interest rates, foreign exchange, we think we're pretty sure we have a niche in that space. But I would have to say, for the 7 firms that are involved in it so far, the focus on day one was, what can we do better for the clients, and how can we service the clients better? And 12 months ago, Karl, we were advocating refinancing in case of a slowdown. Now, I didn't think the slowdown would come this quickly, and I didn't think it would come this sharply. But in economic cycles, we were due one probably in the next 24 months anyway. And we have been advocating to our clients that it was a good time because there was money out there, banks were lending, you could get good terms and conditions. And so, again, we're not reacting to it. This is stuff we've been advocating. We just try to be a little bit ahead of the curve. We won't always get it right. I'm not going to say we will, but we get it more right than we get it wrong, I think. And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was John Finn from Treasury Solutions. And I greatly appreciate John taking the time to share his advice with us this morning. Well, before we go, the local enterprise office's Student Enterprise Awards, which were due to be held last Thursday, sadly fell victim to the COVID-19 outbreak. I would like to offer my heartfelt congratulations to all of the winners and finalists from this year's competition, and I do hope your endeavours this year will spark further entrepreneurial ambitions. For more information about the Student Enterprise Awards and to see a list of the winners and runners-up, you can go to the local enterprise office website.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.